Okay, well, thank you very much. This is a great topic. Charles, you talked about and asked about productivity and the measurement of it. A long time ago when I was at the ANU and with the federal government, in fact, I led a study on trying to measure productivity in agriculture over the last 100 years. And it is actually a very difficult thing to measure, because the key measure of productivity is really something called total factor productivity. In other words, it's not just looking at labour productivity, which can increase by adding capital, but if you don't use that capital efficiently, it's not really an increase in productivity. Because it's so difficult to measure, funnily enough, and what's not measured tends not to get managed. Because it's so difficult to measure, economists, it's peculiar, isn't it? We actually measure it as a residual. We measure all the other things and we say the rest is productivity, which means we don't really understand the drivers of it. So, an incredibly important point. This session is really about education, in a sense, a fundamental underpinning of long-term productivity. We have limited time. We have four unbelievably distinguished people to talk about this. So I'm not going to go through much in the way of introductions or bios, because you have access to that there. I'm going to kick off with Colleen. Colleen is with the Institute of Public Affairs, which is a well-respected think tank in Australia. Really does fundamental research on really the drivers of our economy, on productivity and our competitiveness. Colleen, your background is not actually in universities, it's actually at schools and school education. And frankly, if school education doesn't produce quality inputs for universities, then there's not a huge amount the universities can do. Just take us through what your research is finding there.
So my personal background, my very first job was as a school teacher. I have a master's degree and I had quite a long time in schools. And I moved out, I've been an education consultant, worked in politics, and then business as well. But I have a personal overview of this, but the work that I do now at the Institute of Public Affairs is Director of Schools Program, which is what's actually happening in our educational institutions, particularly in primary, secondary and entry into university courses. And the amount of non-core time that is spent in schools now, I'll call it woke for want of a better quick terminology to use, but for example, in the primary school curriculum, and it's a mandated curriculum, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders history and culture and sustainability are embedded into every subject at every year level all the time. Now, it doesn't matter what your politics is, that has an impact on output. So at the moment in Australia, the average 15-year-old student is nearly a year and a half behind where they were 15 years ago. Across the board, our year nines are about 33% of all year nines in Australia do not meet minimum benchmark performance in literacy and numeracy. And it starts at the very beginning. Our grade threes, which is our 8-year-olds at the foundation level, are similarly failing. So it's not about politics, it's about what is in the curriculum that the children are being taught and the amount of time that is not being spent on core foundational skill sets. So by the time they get to year 12, we only have now 9% of students who are studying higher mathematics, which of course has ramifications for entering into the STEM field. And the politics of this, as well as with university sit-ins where students are demanding to cut ties in research with Lockheed Martin and BAE and that sort of stuff. So this sort of ideology that's in the curriculum is having an impact on the academic results of what goes into the university students. I don't know if that summarises enough what's going on there.
Well, it's pretty stark. I should have actually mentioned, in terms of that productivity study of agriculture, over about 100 years, while we'd increased capital, we hadn't really increased total factor productivity very much. It's pretty poor. And the Australian Productivity Index, and now, apart from the fact that Jim Chalmers is talking about a summit, the attention to it in a serious sense is frankly hopeless. And I think, Colin, you're starting to give a sense of where the foundations of that lie. A long time ago, I was actually born in Sri Lanka, and for the first 16 years, my parents were representing Sri Lankan tea, of all things, in Australia. So we used to go backwards and forwards. And to pick up what Colleen's saying, many people have said, your English is very good, how come? Well, let me say it was actually because of my education in Sri Lanka, not in Australia. Because Sri Lanka has little luxury for conflating a whole range of issues, and you learnt actually the fundamentals. At basic school, you learnt the fundamentals of grammar, arithmetic, and so on. And I just cannot overemphasise what you're saying, Colleen, in terms of how important those fundamentals are.
Well, the research shows that our year nines are reading and writing to the level of about a 9-year-old. So the ramifications for this going forward are very serious. We do not have the percentage of the population that are ready for the next generation of innovation. That's just statistically a fact that we really have to grapple with.
Right. So on the one hand, I'm very pleased to actually hear that there's some awareness of Aboriginal studies in the schools, because when I was going through it, it didn't exist. But I think what you're saying is conflating that with the fundamentals of education really, that doesn't help.
What they call the cross-curriculum priorities of sustainability and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders histories and culture means that every subject and every year level, and I can't emphasise that enough, it means that young children are learning how to count through Aboriginal dance, the absolute sort of quantification of science is through Aboriginal culture. Now, again, it doesn't matter what your politics are and what you think about Aboriginal history, it has a place, but not when you're trying to learn how to count. And so, our recommendation would be that, of course, we need our history told warts and all, but it should be at year 9 or 10 where the subject integrity is maintained, because every minute that you're spending on this in the foundational areas is time that they're not learning literally how to read and write. Yep. And so when we have our 15, and by the time, when you fall apart, all research will tell you that by the time a child is about, give or take, 7 or 8 years old, if they are falling behind then, it's not impossible, but it is extremely difficult for them to catch up. So our early years learning being polluted is extremely problematic. And if they're 15 years old and they are falling behind, that's pretty much it for life.
Right. Thank you, Colleen. I'm going to switch now to Jim Clooney. Jim, you're sort of perfectly positioned for this panel, because background as an engineer, Australian background, an entrepreneur and innovator in Australia, but you've now, through a company called Willow, set up an operation in America, headquartered in Seattle. So in terms of, first of all, picking up what Colleen's saying, what are you seeing in terms of the quality of graduates coming through universities as in suitability for your business? And you might just give us a bit of background on what your business is doing.
Okay, thanks, Arun. So you might see me in the program as listed as TCI Renewables, which is a previous life to some extent. So I'm now involved with Willow Technologies, which is an Australian software engineering company, and originating here in Australia, now headquartered in the United States. It's an organisation that's being driven by and funded by myself and Nicholas Moore, who many of you will know. And we are carving out a position in the United States for this Australian business in the digital twin space, and with particular reference to higher education, which is why I enjoying being on this panel. But we do a lot of work with universities across the United States. We have a digital twin deployed live on, I think it's 12 universities now, and entertaining a lot more. One of them very close to you in northern Arizona. We find that I guess there's two conclusions to draw from what we're seeing. One of the important things is that, and every industry faces this, is what do you do with your ageing workforce, particularly in facilities management, where people who have a lifetime of analogue experience are about to retire, they're about to walk out the door, and all that knowledge goes with them. And that is a potential disaster for innovation and the continuation of knowledge, because we have, for example, the guy we like to call Boiler Room Bob, who's very analogue, and he works out what's wrong with the compressor by putting his hand on it and feeling the vibration, and he knows what's wrong. He's going to retire in 2 years' time, and that knowledge goes out the door with him. So digital twins and, to an extent, machine learning and AI can capture Bob's knowledge, integrate it into a system that stays there forever, and therefore you don't have this drain of knowledge leaving. The second important factor in that is that the replacement for Boiler Room Bob, the new employee, is not going to be the same guy. He's going to be a man or a woman who are much more tech savvy and much more interested in using technology in the job that they do to manage facilities or manage infrastructure. So the whole thing needs to change. We can't have an analogue approach to infrastructure management and development and innovation going forward. We have to embrace the digital world. Digital transformation is everywhere. Where we think it works well in what Willow does in the digital twin space as a commercial organisation and working with universities is that, and it actually started with Northern Arizona University and Flagstaff, where we've allowed students and researchers access to the front end of our product so that research projects and senior level students can start working with a real commercial product that's live on their campus and start developing and writing in the low-code environment, writing insights and drawing conclusions and hopefully coming up with good innovations and good ideas to add to an already existing commercial product. So it's good for the students, good for the researchers, good for us, and ultimately good for the quality of the graduates that come out. So bringing that real-world commercial experience into a genuine student experience, I think is an essential part of innovating, staying on pace with the digitisation of the world and producing a better quality of graduate.
Jim, to the extent, because you've operated in both countries, just picking up Colleen's point, to what extent are you seeing a difference in the quality of graduates coming in out of Australia compared to the US? And you know, the US is a big place, and it's a vast generalisation. But
Yeah,
what insights might you provide?
I don't feel terribly qualified, given that I've only lived in the US for a year, but I did live in the UK for 12 years and was educated there and also here in Australia. I think that what we're seeing in Australia is an environment where most of our graduates, most degrees are very vocationally focused, and students come out with a narrow path to their career, whereas elsewhere in the world, particularly in the UK and the US, graduates come out with a much sort of broader approach to what might I do with the rest of my life. Now, there are obviously some exceptions to that. If you study dentistry or medicine, then that's probably where you'll go. But there's a lot of other degrees, undergraduate degrees, that are very focused in Australia on where your career path might go, whereas I think in the United States and the UK, there's a much broader approach to, you know, it's a university education. What you then do with that, you've got a lot more options, and I think the structure of the programs, the structure of the degrees equip graduates with a broader base and a broader approach to their career going forward. I think in Australia we probably need to broaden the curriculum. We're not going to lose focus on the STEM subjects, I'm sure, but I think in there can be an acceptance and an understanding that, well, that may not be where you end up for the rest of your life. I studied structural engineering, and that's not what I do now. Yeah. And it took me a while to work that out, but I think I came out with a very, very vocationally focused degree, and I would have benefited from being a bit broader as a graduate.
That's a great point, because literally in a few hours I'm supposed to go to the airport and catch a flight to London. So I apologise, I won't be able to stay for much longer. But my son is graduating out of Oxford. He's just got his PhD there. And he spent part of his life studying at Sydney University, part of his life at Bristol and Oxford. And what I've noticed as a fundamental difference, and Sydney University is a prestigious university, but there's a greater vocational education means there's much more emphasis on what to think, which may prepare you for a short period of time, as distinct though about how to think. And the point about that difference is when you, in a world which is changing rapidly, where technology is changing rapidly, what to think is only valuable at a short point in time. How you solve problems, which I think is essentially what you're saying, is a more lifelong capability and gives you the ability to adapt and be much more competitive. And I've just noticed this difference in a sense through my sons, and more generally be involved in the university sector. Okay, thank you Jim. Peter Dwyer, you're actually with the university sector, so you actually see it with Iowa, and you also have an engineering background. Your comments and thoughts on this?
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate being on this august panel. Just like to reflect a little bit. July, it turns out, is a month of important anniversaries. Now, I know where you're going. The anniversary of the memorandum of separation with George III being one, but that's not the one
That's what immediately came to mind.
Most importantly, and this gets to Iowa State and the kind of university that we are, and Suresh will dovetail on this a little bit as well. In July of 1862, the Morrill Act that established land-grant universities in the United States was signed in the middle of the Civil War. This was an experiment in higher education access for the citizens of the U.S., but in particular, an emphasis on the mechanics, the farming, and among other things. So July 2nd was an important date for us, and it was when Iowa Agricultural College and Model Farm, a very specific title, was created, and that's where I am today in Ames, Iowa. Fast forward a number of years, July was also the anniversary of Vannevar Bush's report back to then President Truman on science, the endless frontier, July 1945, and that was really setting the benchmark for establishing the U.S. National Science Foundation and the beginnings of federal investment in research, particularly at universities like Iowa State, like University of Arizona, among others. And it also established the very important ties between the U.S. federal government, higher education, and research, and the connection with the communities. And I go back to our land-grant university roots at Iowa State. That model farm is an important part of education for our students. Not everyone will go on to be a farmer necessarily, but that's an important piece of the connection with the communities, the engagement with communities, and a way of transmitting information in two directions. That it's an important part of the education of our students even today. And we extend that relationship, that university, government, private sector partnership relationship to Australia today. My colleague, John Spates, is here from CSIRO, one of our key partners in biosecurity and advancing safe and secure agriculture for a secure nation, a secure world.
So let me just build this up and follow up with you, Peter, and then this will, I think, segue nicely to Suresh, again, coming from a great university. One of the key themes nowadays is this theme of translational research. So to give you just a practical and personal example of this, and this is both an opportunity and also a challenge. Back in the early 80s, I was at the ANU. It was the Thatcher-Reagan era deregulation, basically moving to a very, very, very different world. And again, we're going through massive both technology transitions and policy transitions. And at the ANU, I was in a research department. We were doing a lot of work for Treasury in this massively changing world. And so I had deep research insights because ANU, the depth of research there was very good. Somehow in this, I saw an opportunity in this new world to also create a new financial advice, wealth management business. But I knew nothing about business. And I went and spoke to my professors and said, look, I'm starting to try and understand investment. There's a thing called a P/E ratio. What is that? And some of the greatest economists in Australia, and Arthur, you'd know them, actually had no idea back at that time what a P/E ratio was. Anyway, as Charles knows, I started a company with one of my colleagues and friends here, Derek Young, and Derek were here for the session, so please grab him. And what I saw was universities had this fantastic depth of research, but the academics by and large didn't really translate that into the real world. In the business world, when I began to speak to people in the investment world and talk to them about the Thatcher-Reagan revolution and what it meant for the world and change and so on and so forth, there was no understanding of that in the business world. And so there's this big gap, which I think you're alluding to, Peter. And I think the opportunity for business and academia is to actually build a bridge. And essentially that was that there were four of us, and our average age was about 24 or 25. And we capitalised the company at about $100,000. But over the next 20 years, just basically filling that gap allowed a really huge enterprise to build. If you look at the great technology businesses by people like Gates and Jobs and so on, they weren't academics, but they mastered the knowledge of the fundamentals of technology, and then filled that gap. What can be done to further improve the building of those bridges, Peter? And that's going to be the same question for you, Suresh.
Certainly working with students and embedding concepts of entrepreneurship, engaging our students with internships with industry. I was a beneficiary of a program in the U.S. Called the Co-op, which was a go to school for a semester, a term, then go work in industry for a term. And I had the great pleasure of learning industry from the DuPont Corporation in Wilmington, Delaware, and made some fantastic connections. But I also recognized through that process that my passion lay not necessarily in the production of nylon and improving the catalytic efficiencies of oxidation chemistry, but rather in the classroom and mentoring graduate students and being a leader that way in higher education. And I think experiences like that, the internships, the co-ops, the connection of the applications of what you're learning at fundamentals at university, regardless whether you are at a Research One, high output research university like ours, or whether you're in a regional comprehensive institution or a community college, being embedded in the private sector, I think, is an important opportunity for us in higher education that we should be providing to our students.
Thank you. Suresh Garimella from Arizona, president of Arizona University, as Charles said, a very famous research university. Maybe just give us a little bit of your background, Suresh, and then the comments on this topic.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here, and I just really want to thank math teachers around the world. It's such an underappreciated thing. We don't pay our teachers enough in the United States, and I hope you do, and we need more of you, and I wish you had stayed being a teacher. But anyway, so the K through 12 education is so critical to what happens after that, and I will say we don't have the answers in the United States either. So I am a mechanical engineer. I spent a lot of my time at Wisconsin and then at Purdue University for 20 years, and at the University of Vermont for 5 years as president, where the desk that Senator Justin Morrill signed the land grant or wrote the Land Grant Act at was in my office, and it inspired me every day. Didn't let anyone touch it, but it was right there. So he was a senator from the state of Vermont, and I think this whole concept of engagement is newish in the United States. It's moved on from extension and farming, which was much of the Land Grant Act, which actually called for education in the mechanic and agricultural arts. That was the phrase, but really what it meant was to democratize education. Education at that time was to go study theology at Harvard. And rich people could do it. A few rich boys could do it. It really brought education to the masses. And I think the large land-grant universities in the country are the best experiment in higher education anywhere in the world. At least that's my opinion. So I guess my comment will come as a follow-up to that. So, too often, so the state support for universities, public universities in the United States is dropping quite rapidly. And therefore, of course, the students pick up, the student tuition and such picks up the slack. The federal government's investment in basic research has pretty much stayed flat, or in inflation numbers has gone down. The R&D from the private sector has gone up a lot. So I think universities really need to not rely only on old traditional sources of funding. I think those that figure out true partnerships with various sectors, foundations, the private sector, government, and local entities are the ones that I believe will succeed and move into the future. I came to Australia knowing a little bit about, having an impression. I'd done a sabbatical at the University of New South Wales 30 years ago here in Sydney. And I was so pleased that in all of our meetings with all walks of life, including shadow ministers and ministers who are in power right now, ANU and Monash University, et cetera, it's clear to me that there are some very clear, and to address the topic of the panel, there are at least 4 areas that I think are ripe for partnerships between Australian universities, US universities, and with support from governments as appropriate, but also from the private sector. So there are universities in this country that are really quite advanced in space sciences of one sort or another. We were at the Stromlo Observatory yesterday, and the University of Arizona is perhaps a global leader in optical sciences, space sciences, and such. I mean, I think there's a lot of partnership possibilities there. And that's of interest to the government as well, because there's a national security imperative, there's an intelligence imperative to this thing. And the whole AUKUS effort, I think, relies heavily on that. A second area, I mean, this is not a surprise to you. Australia has got in its ethos mining and critical minerals. Deborah mentioned it earlier today. The University of Arizona's first department was a mining department. And, the state is famous for its mining. The University of Arizona has the only vertical shaft, a working mine in the US. So I think there's a lot of overlap. The University of Western Australia, Curtin, I mean, many universities have deep partnerships here. Of course, you've got BHP and others here. A third area, I believe, is, Charles mentioned uranium, but there's also another form of energy, fusion energy, which is cleaner. It's around the corner, and finally, after many, many decades of being 3 decades away, it may now be less than a decade away. We're investing in fusion energy, and there's a lot of materials issues, radiation hardening issues, et cetera, which there's expertise in universities here and in the United States. And a fourth area, as has also come up, is AI. I mean, AI is everywhere. People are worried about it, but applying it to things like healthcare, and you mentioned the digital twin. So we're very, very interested in that. I think these 4 areas, as an example, are definitely areas that multiple sort of sectors in Australia and the US can collaborate and should, and are.
And just staying within your university, in terms of building those bridges between, on the one hand, fundamental research, really deep thinking, not practical research, but then linking that deep thinking, building that bridge into practical outcomes. What are some of the ways that your university facilitates that?
Yeah, so I served in the National Science Board, which oversees the National Science Foundation. We talked a lot about basic research and applied research. The first directorate in the National Science Foundation in 30 years that was formed was called Technology and Innovation Partnerships. And so the idea was to take all the sort of basic research that NSF supported, but to focus specifically on translation as well, on what it does to regional economies, to placemaking, as was mentioned, to workforce development and such. I think too often people have talked about basic or applied research. I have never found in my own research, and I've trained 100 PhD students or graduate students, There isn't a dichotomy between those. And industry research doesn't mean applied research either, right? So, I had 45 companies fund my own work. But we did extremely fundamental research because it was pre-competitive. We looked at the root cause of what was preventing industries from becoming more competitive and such. And so that was of value to everyone. So I think that the sooner we stop worrying about whether something is basic or applied, because everything starts at the basic level, you need the basic underpinnings. But it's very helpful for students to have some application in mind as they're studying. Undergraduate students who are learning calculus or partial differential equations think, why the heck am I doing this stuff? But I think if you can somehow tie it to an application, it just makes it a lot more fun to learn. I think they're more job ready as a result. I'm not suggesting that we should only train students to get jobs. With a liberal education, a liberal arts education, I believe is extremely important to broaden one's mind. But I think it's better for us not to think about research being either basic or applied, but having a spectrum, and that you want to do all ends of that spectrum to be successful. But I think US universities, just to a question you'd asked earlier, I'm not sure that the students coming out of US universities are better or worse than Australian. The best ones in every country are great. There are always folks who are struggling. But I think what the US education has is more flexibility. Whenever I go to the UK or Australia or so, there's so much bureaucracy around. You set an exam and somebody has to review it and somebody else has to, mark it and all that sort of stuff. There's too much of that sort of oversight, and I think more flexibility. And I think students have a much more flexible path to studying anything they want in the US than other countries. Is probably where some of the benefits come from.
Okay, just looking at Stella and time, so we just need to try and wrap this up. There's some really important threads which will hopefully feed into the subsequent sessions. So we live in a world of just massive, rapid, disruptive change. And that the future is fundamentally unknowable. Well, what's the world going to look like in 5 years' time with AI and everything? Frankly, no one knows. There's the extreme Bill Gates view, which is that there'll be 3 jobs which exist, or 3 types of jobs. But I'm going to suggest that, picking up from the panel, the starting point in a world of massive change is getting the fundamentals right. Starting off with what Colleen said, just the fundamentals of knowledge, of education, not what to think, because that'll be superseded, but fundamentally how to think. It begins in the schools, and we really need to look at that very, very, very carefully. And then that continues on into the university sector. If I look at the universities both you gentlemen represent, if I think of Oxford, the core course at Oxford is PPE, politics, philosophy and education. But it's done at a deep level. The focus is how to think. Oxford has actually produced more world leaders and presidents and prime ministers than any other country. Bill Clinton in America, a chap called Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka, it's quite extraordinary. How to think, not what. The second element, though, which has come through, and Jim, you brought this to life from a business perspective, and both Suresh and Peter brought it to life from an academic, is then linking that deep capability of how to think into translational research. And Suresh, I think you put it well, it's not creating a dichotomy, but creating a capability to actually link this. I visited the Stanford School of Engineering just a few weeks ago as part of a US study tour, and integrated it into that course. And I think, Peter, you're suggesting this is what you're doing at your university in a different context, and similarly with Arizona. Integrated with that is the deep study of physics and particles and everything else. But then there's how do we actually apply this to solving problems? There's a link to industry very early in the piece. Well, that's a foundation, Charles, hopefully for the rest of the afternoon. Well, happy to do questions, providing Stella doesn't stone me for timing.
I have a question, and it's a question of bias about design of curriculum. Maybe Colleen can address this, and Suresh, you might answer the design methodology in the United States of setting curriculums in schools and universities. I'd like to ask a question facetiously. In the United States, do you have mathematics taught predicated
You prefaced it as a facetious question, so I will expand the question a little bit. I think every university in the world is struggling with what's the right curriculum. And I don't think AI will change everything. I'm less worried about AI. I think it'll do a lot of good stuff for us. And I don't think jobs are going to get lost as a result. There'll be new jobs created as well, like with every revolution. But I think that AI at universities has multiple applications. One is in improving curricula and teaching differently. One is in business processes, and a third is in research. And we're all sort of figuring out what that means. No one has an answer yet. Just building a school of AI does not do it. So I think it behooves all of us to look very carefully at how curricula should be designed. I don't think it's a bad thing that our students are better than us at going to ChatGPT or Perplexity or any of these sources to come up with answers. We need to get better at teaching. And I think you cannot keep teaching the same way you have been for 50 years. So you cannot keep teaching the way you learned because things have changed a lot. So I'll broaden your question to say, I think that the more we can look carefully at our curricula, and are we addressing the need of the hour? Are we addressing the student of today who has a very different way of learning than we did? So I think we all could be humble about how we teach.
Peter, sorry I missed you out, Peter. Do you have views here on this? How you design a curriculum, optimize a curriculum content?
Well, I think that Suresh hit on some really key points. And one thing that I would add, and this goes back to my own training and my own history, my own passions, and it's embedding leadership within the curriculum. And leadership can take on any number of aspects, but creating trusted individuals, trusted leaders, is so important to what we do at the university. And if I may add on one more July anniversary, one paper that very few people do recognize as attributable to Vannevar Bush, also published July 1945, was a paper that he wrote, and this is relevant to something you raised earlier, Arun, which is called As We May Think. That particular paper set forth a theory about what he called the Memex machine. The Memex machine was a way of connecting information, in essence, digitizing all that was known at the time and creating an interconnected encyclopedia of knowledge, which really predated the internet, predated Wikipedia, predated the World Wide Web in so many different ways. But it's a very interesting paper to consider about the way we may think and how we embrace information, how we utilize information. And so I'll just add that, because I know AI is an important content in this conversation as well, particularly in our global partnerships. So leadership, though, Charles.
Yeah, very good, Peter.
I mean, my focus, is obviously on the students who are entering university. But what Australia has that America doesn't have to our detriment is a national curriculum that is mandated through every state. And that kind of prevents a lot of innovation, because there isn't this scenario where somebody's doing something great over here, we should copy it. Best practice. It's because everybody has to do the same thing. So to deconstruct that centralisation, I think, would be a good move in Australia. The other scenario I mentioned before about the ideology that's within the curriculum. For example, our students come out the end of school being very concerned about renewable energy. It's their mandate to believe that that's the only way to go. The consequence of that, thankfully, is that they think that clean energy is the only thing that matters, and therefore they're quite supportive of nuclear, because it has never been mentioned as a bad thing within the curriculum. So the real issue is our education system is telling children, or it's telling students, what to think, not how to think. So we have to deconstruct it in a way to decentralise and reward best practice because there are some places that are doing great things, but it is constrained by ideology that is embedded. And so because of that, we have this sort of feeling approach to education rather than an academic approach to encouraging innovative thought. So by the time they get to university, they're not really ready. And of course I'm speaking in general terms, there are amazing students out there, but as a general rule, the percentage of our population that is academically and mentally nimble and ready for innovative thought to explore great new things is compromised.
Could I just say one thing, and that is this: there's nothing wrong with having a differentiated system. It's all right for different universities to offer different capabilities, and that's where I think you need some innovation. Maybe there are some schools that are particularly good at one aspect of learning, and students should have a choice. So I think that's missing when you have a uniform.
Unlike America, our parents don't have choice of school. We have independent schools, of course, but if you go to the government school, you are assigned to your local area. And so deconstructing that to send your child wherever you want to go to would be helpful in our situation as well.
Okay, just a last point I'd just like to pick up, and then we do need to wrap up, Stella, is a very important point in passing, and Suresh, which is how we teach in this modern world is important as well. I'd just like to give one example. So I'm involved in chairing 2 university advisory boards. One is the College of Business and Economics at ANU. The other is a very interesting university called the SP Jain Global School of Management. Not sure if any of the SP Jain people are here. There we are, right, marvellous. So essentially a focus on business, but the perspective of the founder is that business is now global. And so there's about 6 or 7 campuses around the world: London, Dubai, Sydney, Australia, San Francisco. And all students have to actually basically go through at least 3 of those campuses. That's part of how you get a global perspective. You don't just get it by sitting at Stanford or Iowa or Sydney. A second aspect is, though, thinking through the whole method of teaching, which is going from, if you like, sage on the stage, imparting knowledge, to actually saying, let's in part now use modern technologies, AI and so on, where the students can actually learn the fundamentals at their own pace. But then the lecturer, the teacher, becomes a coach, sets problems, helps students to, and coaches students through the solving of problems. And this is this connection between understanding fundamentals and then being able to apply them. So I think we don't really have time to go into this in detail, but please speak to my friends at SPJ in here, because the teaching methodology at school and university needs to be, I think, rethought in this modern world. Charles and Deborah, thank you very much for this opportunity. Would you please thank the panel, extraordinarily distinguished panel.